everyone, welcome to the episode that deals with photography elements and principles. I am Sakshi Mandwal and our subject expert today is Radhika Khanna, Assistant Professor in Puducherry University. Photography is the science and art of capturing instances of time, freezing a scene to help create a visual documentation of happenings. With the invention of photography, it became possible to record events not just in words, but also with images that portrayed them as they happened. As we have already discussed what photojournalism is, in this module, we'll learn more about the elements and principles of photography. Photography, its beginning. We all know very well what a camera is used for. Since its invention, cameras have contributed immensely to the process of documenting historical events. Cameras have undergone drastic changes over the years from a simple pinhole arrangement to the sophisticated setup that they are today. Simply put, a camera is a light-tight box with a lens on one side and a capturing mechanism on the other end. The cameras used commonly in recent years are mostly single-lens reflex, SLR. They are professional, portable and have a 35 mm film. But lately the films have been replaced by digital sensors in the digital cameras DSLR. Apart from the professional DSLRs, we also have smaller and more compact digital cameras, what are called point and shoots. A DSLR gives you more options to choose from, whereas a point and shoot, as the name suggests, lets you point at an object and shoot. It has limited options to choose from but is most useful for beginners in photography. Digital technology is very easy and convenient to use. Once you are familiar with it, you can start experimenting with digital image making. When taking pictures with the DSLR, you would have to take care of the quality of the picture, which is the image resolution. You can also choose the file format for taking the picture, which could be RAW, JPEG or TIFF. It is also important to know metadata, which is also known as shooting data. Metadata describes the data recorded by the camera about the photograph. What are the elements of photography? The elements that go into making a good photograph include focus or sharpness of the photograph, its composition and use of light and lens. Three parameters that influence the lens system and determine the quality of an image are aperture, shutter speed and sensitivity. These parameters control the amount of light entering into the lens system and decide the exposure of the subject. What is aperture? Aperture is a hole-like structure in a camera that controls the amount of light entering the camera. If the subject is dark, the aperture must be opened wide enough to let as much light as possible into camera. If the subject is too bright, then a small opening in the aperture is enough to let adequate light into the camera. The aperture is like the iris of a human eye. In addition to controlling light, aperture also controls the depth of field. The size of the aperture is called f-stops. The lower the value of aperture, higher is the amount of light entering the lens. The size ranges from 1.4 or 1.8 to 22 or 32, depending on the camera. Every time you step down an f-stop, that is close the aperture. For example, from f by 4 to f by 5.6, the amount of light entering is reduced by half. While every time you step up, that is open the aperture, for instance from f by 22 to f by 16, the amount of light entering is doubled. What is shutter or shutter speed? Shutter is a door-like structure in front of the lens that closes after a particular exposure time to allow light to strike the sensor. Cameras have variable shutter speeds ranging from 1 by 30, which is 1 by 30th of a second, to 1 by 8000. The speed of the shutter determines the amount of light entering the camera. Higher the speed, lesser is the light entering into the lens. Slower shutter speed allows blurring the motion, while higher shutter speeds freeze the action. In slower shutter speeds, it always advisable to use a tripod or monopod to avoid shaking of the camera. What is digital ISO sensitivity? Apart from aperture and shutter speed, another parameter that allows you to adjust for different lighting conditions is the sensitivity, also known as ISO, International Standards Organization. It adjusts the sensor's sensitivity to light. But when sensitivity is increased, the image also has a lot of digital noise in the form of grains, and the color information and smoothness of the image is lost. The maximum advisable level of ISO is 1000, while the minimum is 200. The ISO of an individual frame can be changed. For example, one frame can be exposed outside at ISO 100, while another frame may be exposed indoors at ISO 800. How to choose the right parameters then? The three parameters of aperture value, shutter value and ISO can be chosen depending on the situation and the judgment of the photographer. Only by experimenting with different values can you see for yourself what suits your needs. The important thing is not to miss the moment. A basic judgment of lighting and anticipation of what will happen always helps in taking good photographs. What are the different modes of exposure in a camera? A digital camera primarily has 4 modes of exposure. Aperture priority mode, A or AV, gives you full control over choosing the aperture. According to the amount of light required, you can set the aperture value. The shutter speed is chosen by the camera to match the aperture and give optimum exposure for the image. But the photographer is the best judge of what aperture to choose to get the desired image. For example, while shooting a landscape photo in which there is more than one element that has to be in focus, you should go for a high aperture value, say f/16. By doing so, all the elements in the picture will be in sharp focus. On the other hand, while taking a portrait of somebody, you may wish to keep only your subject in focus and the background in soft focus. To do that, the aperture should be set to a low value, say f/3.5 or f/2.4. Shutter priority mode, S or TV, gives you option of choosing the shutter speed. The speed can be chosen according to whether you want the action to be frozen or you want to have a blurring effect. The camera then sets an aperture value that will match with the shutter speed and give optimum exposure for the image. 1/125 is usually the ideal shutter speed if you want to freeze the action of a moving subject. The decision to choose what shutter speed to use largely lies with the photographer and the demands of the situation. Program mode, P, is also known as the auto mode. In program mode, you just have to click photos. The combination of shutter speed and aperture is preset in the camera. It helps you to understand what the optimum setting is. That doesn't mean you should be comfortable and content with just the auto mode and not discover the creative potential of photography through further experimentation. Manual mode, M, is the option where you can choose the aperture, shutter speed and ISO. You can choose the aperture according to the light requirement and then adjust the shutter speed to get the correct exposure. For example, the same scene captured at aperture f/22 and shutter speed 1/125 will look different from the one taken with aperture f/2.8 and shutter speed 1/50. The first image will be sharp while the second would have shallow depth of field. These two different photographs of the same place would express a photographer's creative choice of portraying the scene. Therefore, you should not be afraid to experiment with all the available options until you get the result that you want. What is depth of field? The aperture, along with controlling the amount of light, also controls the depth of field or the area of acceptable focus. To understand this concept, we need to know how to control the acceptable sharpness at the point of focus, its foreground and background. The subject is the point of focus, the area in front of the subject is the foreground, and the area behind the subject is the background. A small aperture opening, which is one with a large f number, gives a greater depth of field. As we can see that at an aperture value of f/22, we have maximum area in sharp focus. But as the aperture value decreases to f/2.8, the subject is in sharp focus, whereas its foreground and background elements are visible but not focused. In other words, it gives a shallow depth of field. What is a correct exposure? It is important to know the exposure triangle to understand correct exposures. The three elements that form the exposure triangle are aperture, shutter speed and ISO, which we have already discussed. These three elements are interdependent on each other. Adjusting one parameter on your camera affects the other. You should not limit yourself to taking photos with just f by 5.6 aperture, which is the optimum aperture opening for a proper exposure, and 1 by 125 shutter speed because it's a safe bet. Never be afraid to try new things with your camera. One of the ways of doing so is to do exposure bracketing. What are lenses? A camera lens is either a single optical lens or a combination of lenses arranged in a way so as to create images of an object on a screen. Lenses can either be permanently fixed like in point and shoot cameras, or different lenses for different focal lengths are available. These lenses are interchangeable and are used according to the demands of the situation. Based on the angle of view, lenses can be classified into three types. A normal lens is of focal length 50 mm for SLR cameras and 31 to 38 mm for DSLR cameras. It can cover approximately 47-degree angle of view. A wide angle lens has a focal length of 24 mm to 35 mm for SLR cameras and 15 mm to 21.8 mm for DSLR cameras. Lenses with focal length below 10 mm are called fish eye lens. The angle of view ranges from 84 to 63 degrees. Wide angle lenses capture more subject detail by providing greater depth of field at any given f-stop than a normal or telephoto lens. A telephoto lens has a focal length of 85 mm to 300 mm for SLR cameras and 53.1 mm to 187.5 mm for DSLR cameras. Telephoto lenses have a narrower picture angle 28 to 8 degrees than a normal lens and make subjects appear larger. A zoom lens is a mechanical assembly of lenses whose focal lengths are varied. For example, a zoom lens could have focal length ranging from 24 mm to 70 mm or 18 mm to 55 mm. Therefore, a zoom lens gives you a variety of focal lengths to choose from. Angle of shooting. The angle of shooting is the angle from which you look at your subject through the viewfinder of the camera. It is always advisable to choose an angle that is in alignment with the height of your subject so that your picture looks closer to reality. There are different angles in which you can shoot. Let's have a look. Eye level angle. Eye level angle is the most commonly used angle of shooting. The camera is placed at the eye level of the subject. Note that the eye level refers to the subject and not the photographer. High angle. When the camera is placed above and looking down at the subject, it is called high angle. In a high angle shot, the subject appears smaller than what it really is. Low angle. A low angle shot gives a larger than life appearance. As opposed to high angle, here the subject gains more and more prominence. Cycle of light. As already seen, light plays a very important role in exposure of a photograph. Light has different characteristics during different time of day and night. For example, the quality of light would change if you shoot at different times of the day, such as before sunrise, in the morning, at midday, during afternoon, in the evening or at night. By knowing the kind of light and its effects, you can then plan your photograph. Types of lighting. The next element that we need to look at is the different angles from which light can be used to illuminate a subject. It can be front lighting, where the subject is illuminated from the front, side lighting, where the subject is illuminated from either of the sides, top lighting, where the subject is illuminated from the top, and back lighting, where the subject is illuminated from behind. Each type of lighting gives a different type of effect. For instance, front lighting flattens the image, whereas back lighting gives a silhouette effect. What is composition? Till now we have covered the essential elements of photography, but photography doesn't end here. Just by knowing the science behind photography will not always help you, though it is very important to know how to handle camera and the different settings. Apart from these, an aesthetic sense and judgment of what should be in the frame and what can be avoided is also very important. It is this judgment which determines the composition of your photograph. Composition refers to the content of a photograph, the way the elements present in the frame, including the main subject, its size and position, and other objects surrounding it are placed. A well-composed photograph is balanced and seems natural. It invites the attention of the viewer. A good composition should have an emphasis, that is, a focal point that attracts the eye of the viewer. As shown in this photograph, which depicts the ruins after a riot in Dharmapuri. The single toy, lying abandoned amidst all the broken and damaged utensils, portrays the aftermath of the violence. The spacing between objects should be well defined, especially the dark and light areas, also known as positive and negative space, should be utilized properly. You may want to ask yourself, how much space is around my subject? Where is my subject within the compositional frame? And as you look through the viewfinder, which is more important, the subject or the background? We know now that taking a photograph is not just clicking one through your camera. Before actually taking a picture, you need to visualize and compose your photo mentally. While framing your photograph, here are some guidelines that will help you. You should always try to avoid clutter in your frame. Often, less number of elements in the frame helps the viewer in understanding the subject. If there are too many things in the frame, the focus of the photograph is scattered. Similarly, try and avoid using many colors. A color photograph need not necessarily include all the colors. Try to keep it simple and focus on the primary point of interest for the photograph.
Composition is a very essential part of photography. In fact, I would say it's the backbone of photography. A picture can be made or destroyed because of good or bad composition. Some people also use the word framing. So it is about how you place the various elements within the frame. A frame can be made of 2, 3, 4 or many elements. Like if you are taking a scene of a table like where I am sitting, there are my hands, my face, the background. It is where you place me. Right now I am the central character of this interview. So the photographer here who is recording me has placed me centrally. There could be another situation where I may not be the central part of the frame, and there may be something else, so I may be on the edge of the frame. So framing or composition comprises of various factors which need to be taken into account to make a frame pleasant, appealing, balanced. There are all these words, and there are many factors that go into doing that. Off the cuff I can say it's the light, the texture, the positioning of elements. It is also about balance. If there is a picture in which you are interviewing me, but I am on one side of the frame and the frame extends on the right side or the other side without anything, then it might seem a very lopsided frame, where where the main element is making it almost seems as if the frame is tilted. So any person has to go basically by his instinct, because we are all visually trained right from our beginning, from the beginning as children, to look at the world from our eyes, and we are also so nurtured that certain things please us. A beautiful sunset pleases us, a beautiful landscape pleases us, some things arranged on a table please us, but we don't know why they please us. They please us because we find them balanced, we find them arranged in a way that suits our mental makeup. Yes, it is also about color. A sunset looks very nice when the sun becomes absolutely orange when it's going down, but it's also, one you would have noticed, any picture which has a good composition of sunset, it is never that the horizon line is always below, it is never on the center. If you have the horizon line in the center of the frame, the frame looks very kind of cut into two. So always a photographer, if he's shooting a sunset, the ideal thing is a sunset in the ocean, in the sea, we always keep the line towards 1/3 below. from or 1/3 from below. That is how the eye has learned to see. So it also wants to see it on a clicked frame or in a moving picture. So that makes us feel that the frame is very balanced. Composition, as I said, before earlier days when photography was black and white, it was all about the tonality of the picture, the shades of gray that we saw. Even a high contrast picture with very sharp light broke a picture into sharp whites and sharp blacks and no grays in between. Whereas another picture, maybe of a misty morning, would have many a shades of gray, which appealed in a different sense because it gave you a feeling of the variable contrast from absolute white to absolute black, but with all the middle shades of gray. So it is also depending, that is how our visual grammar is built. We realize how things, we relate things, frame, color, texture, balance, etc. to moods of emotions. And we connect those moods of emotions. If it is really a tilted frame, it is squared, it is skewed on one side, then the picture may convey a kind of a disturbance. The very basic rule of framing which we all teach to students is something called the rule of thirds. Again, who created the rule of thirds, I don't know, but in our mental makeup, we are always learnt, or our psychology is such that we like pictures in which the main element is placed on the intersection of lines which are drawn, two lines drawn horizontally and two lines drawn vertically. On the intersection, what is the subject is usually placed, our eye goes and settles there, and that is what appeals to us. So in a rule of thirds is a very basic rule which one follows to appreciate a picture, or one is psychologically balanced to like in a frame. But that doesn't mean that we have to stick to these rules of composition. I always teach my students that first learn the rules, do the right things or the more generally appealing things, and then maybe you can experiment and learn to break also. Now with the new cameras, new post-production technologies, much variety of lenses, we can get all sorts of distortions, panoramic views, stretched views of things, and people use them to heighten the effect again of the picture. I mean, people call them gizmos, people call them stunts, etc. But yes, I mean, there would be something interesting, that is why they get popular. People do those also by, or not by using a very straightforward frame, but these are also things that will be available to us. But it is always good to follow the basic compositions and then decide according to the visual grammar and the kind of subject that you are pursuing, what kind of framing or composition to go by. I mean, there is distortions. We all know that a wide angle lens creates perspective distortion. An extreme fisheye lens creates those curvy linear distortions. That doesn't mean it is a bad frame, but yes, the demand of the situation may be such that those things will also appeal to us and make the framing or the language of storytelling much better.
Rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a rule of thumb or guideline used for composing visual images. The image is divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines. What you want the viewer to look at should be placed along these lines or the point where the lines cross. Aligning a subject along these points creates more interest than simply having your subject in the center. Visual literacy. Visual communication, which is the process of communicating through signs and symbols, includes photography. Along with the above discussed elements of visual design and creating a composition, what is required is visual literacy to be able to effectively use the medium of photography. The ability to read, interpret and derive meaning from an image is called visual literacy. Visual literacy goes a step beyond textual literacy, stressing on the fact that pictures can also communicate and that pictures can be read like we read any text material and interpret it. As a photographer and photojournalist, your work can invite debates and discussions and stimulate thought and action in other people. Seeing is always subjective. Therefore, what you show in your photograph is interpreted differently by different people based on their ability to understand the signs and symbols in the photograph. Becoming visually literate is a small step that can help you to take photographs through which you can communicate with people. Photo manipulation. To do or not to do? So far, we have discussed the essentials of how to take a photograph. Photojournalists are not just optical historians documenting events through photographs, they have to keep up with fast-growing technology. With the changing technology, they also have to be aware of the ethical responsibilities that come with it. A photograph must be an accurate depiction of an event as it happens. Altering certain parameters may change the meaning of the photograph. Therefore, photojournalists must be careful of how they utilize the manipulation techniques to their benefit without hampering the originality of the image. There are many softwares like Photoshop and Lightroom that can be used for cropping, exposure adjustments, color correction, etc. These tools have both advantages and disadvantages. Where on one hand, these tools help in making the picture more aesthetically appealing, on the other hand, there is a risk of manipulating the meaning of the picture. If you are aiming to be a photojournalist, there are certain guiding principles that you should follow. Firstly, you must think if any manipulation is necessary or not. The most important principle is that the content of the picture should not be changed. It should not mislead the public. As a photojournalist, you have an obligation to show facts as they are. You can build your credibility only by presenting images that are closer to reality as it happened than what you construct as reality by altering the pictures. Conclusion. Once you have a command over photography and have learned how to use this medium, in addition, you need to have an awareness of your role as a photojournalist. Within a very limited time, you have to decide whether a subject is newsworthy, then be able to visualize a good composition that is true to the moment and take the photograph. Presence of mind and quick thinking are two very important qualities required of a photojournalist. Therefore, photojournalists must have a nose for news and be cool under pressure. Along with being sharp and focused, a photojournalist must also be compassionate and human and be aware of the ethical considerations of their assignments. So, as a photojournalist, you must be well read about the subject you are photographing. You have to be educated about the society you live in, the people and their culture. You should be able to tell their stories with as many emotions as possible. As a storyteller, you should always try and get close to your subject and have an intimate rapport, understand their feelings, emotions, flaws and insecurities, and try to project them in your photographs. Recap. In this module, we have learned the basic techniques of photography. We have discussed the different types of cameras starting from Kodak Brownie to the present age DSLRs. We also saw how from silver halide screens, slowly the transition happened. Films were invented and now we have digital capturing mechanism in cameras. We discussed the different types of lens and their various usage, how light affects photography and how at different times of the day the light is different. Most importantly, we learned what makes a good composition and how to keep your frame clutter and chaos-free. In addition, we saw the different angles of shooting and how each angle gives a different meaning to the photograph. We also studied the importance of visual literacy and visual communication, which will help in enhancing your skills as a photographer and photojournalist. That is all that we have for you for today. We hope you enjoyed this session. See you again. Till then, thank you and namaskar.